Today I'm going to talk to you about forms of business ownership, in particular sole traders, partnerships, as well as looking at companies both private and public. The way that we can look at the forms of business ownership is first of all talk about the unincorporated ownerships, sole traders and partnership. They're the simple ones and don't need articles of association and the backing of company law. And the next type are the ones that do need to have that formal backing, and they're what we call incorporated companies. The big difference between the two different types is this concept of limited liability. Let me talk about that for the moment. The first point here is limited to the amount of investment made. So if I invest $100,000 in a set of shares, that's all I can potentially lose. So that means my personal possessions are safeguarded. So if I put in 100,000, that's all I can potentially lose. Another important thing to note is that the owners are separate from the managers of the company. They may overlap, but strictly speaking, they are there to look after the interests of the shareholders in a company. Now let me have a look at the different types of ownership. Let's start with the sole trader. Sole trader obviously only has one owner. As I've earlier explained, it isn't incorporated but has this thing called unlimited liability. It's opposite to limited liability. So if the sole trader happens to go bankrupt, then any personal possessions that sole trader may have is fair game to be sold by the authorities to cover any debts that has been incurred, which is a big difference from the incorporated business forms, limited in case of a private company and a public company. Sole trader is easy to set up, and it's also cheap. The other advantage here is that the profits are 100% owned by the owner, of course, but the expansion in terms of making a business bigger is difficult because of the lack of capital, or the lack of money that needs to be put forward to start or expand the business. The management is usually the owner, so the sole trader is the business person, so there's no separation from the entity itself, and of course there's one person who does all the work. Now let's look at the partnership. That's still unlimited, has unlimited liability, has anywhere between 2 and 20 partners. It is not incorporated. It's reasonably cheap to set up. It's more expensive than a sole trader because usually there's a legal document called a partnership document that needs to be generated by by lawyers. The profits are shared, so if there's two partners, obviously they get 50-50 and so on. The ability to expand is reasonable, but again relatively limited to the amount of partners you have. So that's why people start looking at other forms like a private company. The management is still done by the owners themselves, and quite often what partners do, they try and complement their skills. The downside is that they must share the profits, but they can also share the workload in terms of having different skills or complementary knowledge that can work quite well. And lastly, coming to incorporated enterprises, I'm not going to talk about the public companies so much. They're the shares that we often see traded on the share market. For the terms of the course, I'm just going to explain what a private company is. You have a limited number of owners, and in this case they're called shareholders. As I've already discussed, it is incorporated. It does have that concept of limited liability, so the amount of investment made amounts to the amount that you can potentially lose. Looking at the positive side, of course, you're hoping to make heaps of capital gain. Because there are more laws involved and there's strict guidelines around the Company Act, it is much more expensive to set up. The profits are distributed pro rata to the shareholders. So if I'm a 30% shareholder, I get 30% of the profits. The ability to expand is reasonable. You can obviously go up to 50 people as opposed to partnership that only has 20. So we can bring in more people with more money to increase the capital and therefore the size of the business. But management is totally separate in this business entity, where the board of directors make all the decision, and quite often, not necessarily so, but quite often they can be separate from the owners. And the workload is done by management, and as I said before, there's that separation from management to the owners. If we're considering a really big business, then getting access to more capital from the public is the way to go, and that's why people then operate a public company. Now, the reason why we look at different business ownerships is largely due to the fact that we, as we expand the business, need access to extra money, extra capital. So a person might start off on their own. They then go into a partnership with 2 or 3 more people, and then later on, when there's more capital required, and also when taxation advantages occur in relation to making bigger levels of profit, they might consider a private company. Hopefully that's been useful to you. There's obviously some background reading that you can do on page 12 to page 14 in your text. And just to reiterate, for this course you need to know the different forms of business ownership, the sole trader, the partnership, and the 2 types of companies. Right? But all the exercise that you'll be doing from now on relate to sole traders.